In August 1976, four men who were students at the College of Art and Design in Boston, Massachusetts, decided to take off time from their studies to go on a 2-week camping excursion. The men were twin brothers Jack and Jim Weiner, Chuck Rack, and Charlie Foltz. One night, they all got together at Jim's place to plan out their trip. They looked at many different locations, but they eventually settled on the Allagash Waterway, an extremely remote location in northern Maine. The men were truly going off the grid for this trip, and they had much on the itinerary, from fishing and canoeing to even mountain climbing. After finishing up their studies on Friday, August 20th, the men loaded up their hatchback and hit Route 95 north, heading towards Maine. They traveled all night into the early hours of the morning. Finally, around 8 a.m., they made it to their first stop, Maine's highest mountain, Mount Katahdin, in Baxter State Park. They unloaded the car, set up camp, and got some rest. The men had finally made it to their much-anticipated boys' trip. And at first, things were going quite well. They were telling stories, drinking a few beers, and were generally having a good time. However, the good vibes would not last, as this camping trip wouldn't quite go as planned. Something strange would happen to the men during this trip. Something strange that would haunt them for the rest of their lives.
Very bright light in the sky that had a reddish cast to it. It was so bright, we didn't know what to make of it. This is exactly what it sounded like. It was like, this was it. They were going to get us.
When the next morning came, Sunday, August 22nd, the men got up early to climb Mount Katahdin. They hiked over 11 miles while navigating some pretty dicey sections, including the heart-pounding Knife's Edge. But they summited and made it back down with no issues. The next day, Monday, August 23rd, they participated in some flying with a local guide. And then finally, on Tuesday, they arrived at the Allagash Waterway. This was the main part of the trip. This was where they were going to begin their 10-day backpacking adventure. On the first day, they canoed up to Chamberlain Lake and set up their first camp at the Mudbrook campsite on Mud Beach. They ate their nightly meal as the stars came out in the sky above. All was good, but something strange occurred while they were all chatting around the fire. One of the men, Jim, saw what appeared to be a strange plasmoid-like bright ball phenomenon off in the distance just over the horizon. Hey, what is that? You see that light over there on the ridge? At first, it looked like a very bright star, maybe 2 or 3 times brighter than all the stars around it. But then he took out his binoculars to get a closer look. It was then that he realized that this was no star. It was much closer. It was just up on the ridge of the hill, maybe 200 feet off the ground. Oh, dude, no! Dude! It's literally just right over the treetops. Right up there on the ridge, you see it? Oh my word, bro. This plasmoid-like object hovered briefly before quickly vanishing. Whoa! Did you see that? It's gone. This is how Chuck Rack described the incident in his own words.
We're all camped on a beach on Chamberlain Lake, and we saw a very bright light in the sky that had a reddish cast to it to the east, and we thought it might have been Mars.
Right.
It was so bright, we didn't know what to make of it. But then it just did something strange. It collapsed on itself. It became inverted and closed in like an eyelid coming over an eye.
Right.
And then it disappeared.
They actually weren't the only ones to see it. Another nearby camp group also noticed the star. It was a bit of an odd encounter for sure, but the light could have easily been explained by some strange natural phenomenon. The men then went to bed without any issues. The next day, Wednesday, the men continued to enjoy their time in the wilderness, and nothing unusual happened. The incident was practically forgotten, and they packed up their campsite to move to the next location. The men canoed through Lake Chamberlain up into the neighboring Eagle Lake, where they then set up camp at the Smith Brook campsite. And so far, their trip was going exactly as they planned. They were having like a Milwaukee beer commercial level trip. They were having a good time. It was a boys' trip. But that was all about to change. The next day, on Thursday, August 26th, the day started off great. It was an absolutely beautiful day, and the men were all alone. There were no other campers nearby. The Smith Brook campsite was an extremely remote part of the already remote Allagash wilderness. No one was around. That afternoon, the men made a plan to go night fishing. They were going to go out on the boat, row out into the middle of the lake, and pull an all-nighter casting their lines. So that's exactly what they did. They built a large, huge bonfire on the edge of the shore to mark their camp's location. This was very important. You see, this far up north, up in Maine, the nights are extremely dark. There are hardly any towns nearby. No light pollution whatsoever. So it was imperative that they would start a fire to mark where their campsite was, so they wouldn't get lost. The men then rowed their boat out into the middle of the lake to cast their lines. After about an hour or so, something strange began to happen. Remember that strange orb seen by Jim the night before? Well, it was back. But before we get to that, someone in the comments the other day mentioned that I looked very tired. Well, that's true. I actually am quite tired. Let's quickly talk about something a little more personal. I think I may be the busiest, most stressed out that I've ever been. I'm obviously doing content creation, but I actually have another job. And I should probably mention that I also have 3 kids under the age of 3, twins and a 5-month-old. So I've got a lot going on, and I'm doing it all with not much sleep. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a really happy time in my life. I'm super grateful for all of it, but at the same time, it can still feel quite overwhelming and stressful. And that's where today's video sponsor, BetterHelp, comes in. Therapy has specifically helped me with general life organization. Through therapy, I've learned how to take all the chaos in my life, sort it out, and organize it so that it all becomes more manageable. BetterHelp is an online therapy platform, and they are a great asset when it comes to your mental health. They make starting therapy way more approachable. You can simply take an online quiz and get matched with a licensed therapist. From there, you can talk however you most feel comfortable, via phone, video, or even text. And if a specific therapist is not the right fit, you can easily switch therapists at any time at no extra cost. Remember, therapy is not about having something wrong with you. It's more about having someone there to help you make sense of all the things in your life, your thoughts, your habits, your schedule, your stresses, really anything that's affecting you. Over 6 million people have used BetterHelp so far and has a 4.8 out of 5 rating on the App Store. So if you've been thinking about trying therapy, even just a little, BetterHelp is a really easy place to start. If you would like to try BetterHelp, just head to betterhelp.com/swuggle or click the link in the description to get 10% off your first month. Again, that's betterhelp.com/swuggle or click the link in the description to get 10% off your first month. Thank you so much to BetterHelp for sponsoring the video. While the men were out night fishing on the lake, the strange orb from the night before seemed to return. The first one to notice it this time was Charlie Foltz. He seemed to sense that there was something behind him, so he turned around to see that same orb hovering over the ridgeline. Hey, check it out. Is that the same light from the night before? That's totally the same light. This time, though, it seemed to be slowly moving closer towards the men. It eventually stopped a few hundred feet away, about 200 feet above the water. The orb had a white yellowish hue to it, and it was completely silent. Chuck at first believed it to be an extreme example of swamp gas. I just stay calm, I'm sure it's probably just swamp gas. I'm sure it's just swamp gas, right? But Chuck's hypothesis didn't seem likely. This floating light was different. It was way too big and way too bright. All 4 men continued to watch this strange floating plasmoid completely transfixed. They had never seen anything like it. Jim later described it like this. It had this rolling effect to it, like a miniature sun, very, very bright. It lit the treetops up like daylight, and it was absolutely silent. The orb was estimated to be nearly 80 feet in diameter. After a while, Chuck Rack thought it would be a good idea to try to signal the orb. He grabbed a flashlight and flickered SOS. Suddenly, a spotlight beam descended from the bottom of the bright orb, right onto the water's surface. What was it? Is that a beam? It then began to move. The orb started heading towards the 4 men on their boat. This caused some major pandemonium. Yo, is it coming towards us? The men were obviously freaked out and began frantically rowing towards the shore, back towards the fire. But the orb got closer and closer. Swamp gas doesn't have beams. They kept frantically rowing towards the camp and the fire, hoping that somehow this fire would protect them from this orb. The plasma ball was now extremely close to them. They could even feel heat radiating off the object. And then suddenly, they were back at their camp on the shore. Everyone was a bit confused. They were unsure on how exactly they got there. They turned around to see the bright floating orb, but it wasn't right next to them anymore. It was now far away, back out over the lake. It hovered there for a while and then floated back over the hills onto the horizon. It then started to slowly head back up into the sky until it was just another light that fit in with all the other stars. Their fire, which seemed to be going strong only a few moments before, was now just hot charcoals. It was almost like the past 3 hours were gone. The men were shaken up by the experience and managed to get little sleep that night. The next morning, as they were preparing breakfast, a park ranger was doing his usual rounds and stopped by the camp. The 4 men described their strange encounter with this floating plasmoid and its beam. The park ranger assured them that the light was actually a spotlight that they had just installed for the grand opening of a local hardware store, something similar to one of these searchlight beam things. However, the 4 men disagreed. They all stated that this was something completely different, something that was much brighter and much more menacing. The park ranger informed them that he had not heard of any other strange lights in the sky anywhere over the Allagash wilderness. The 4 men thought the encounter was weird, but they continued on with their camping trip. For the next 6 days, they spent time out on the lake fishing and hanging out, and even though they looked every night, they never again saw that strange orb. After their camping trip, they returned home to Boston. In Boston, they told the story to their friends and family members. They thought it was unusual for sure, but the men just eventually laughed it off and moved on with their lives. Within a few years, the story had almost been forgotten. So maybe it was just some rare nocturnal light. I mean, who cares, right? Why is this weird orb nocturnal light story unique? Well, this story isn't over. The more terrifying aspect of this tale wouldn't occur until 12 years later in 1988. In the late 80s, one of the 4 men, Jim, began to have reoccurring nightmares. The nightmares featured an extremely bright room with a shadowy figure coming towards him. Time and time again, he would wake up frightened. The nightmares became more and more frightening and detailed over time, and it was getting to the point where Jim was afraid to fall asleep. Thankfully, his wife Mary was always there to comfort him when he woke up from these nightmares. While the nightmares varied in some degree, they always included specific elements, like the dark, shadowy figure. One day, Jim's wife was having lunch with her sister-in-law, Jack's wife. During the lunch, Jack's wife briefly mentioned that her husband, who remember was also on the camping trip, was having strange reoccurring nightmares. Jack's wife almost spit out her drink. She stated that her husband Jim was also having strange reoccurring nightmares and that they had been plaguing him for months. Now this actually isn't super unheard of. Remember, these 2 men were not only brothers, they were twin brothers, identical twin brothers. And there are many stories about identical twins sharing different memories or dreams or feelings. Once Jim found out that Jack was having the exact same nightmares, they got together to discuss what exactly was going on. Both of their nightmares seemed to feature strange creatures, and they were trying to figure out if they were reliving some sort of memory, but they never could figure it out. However, several months later, Jim was reading a book called Communion, written by Whitley Strieber. In this specific book, Strieber was going off on how he had been abducted by aliens and what that experience was like. It was at this point that Jim realized that his nightmares were very similar to the alien abduction experience that Strieber described in his book. But there was a problem. Jim didn't remember ever seeing aliens or being abducted, until he thought about it for a little bit longer. And then he remembered his strange UAP/UFO encounter in the Allagash wilderness 10 years prior. Now I know what you're thinking, okay, what? Well, this is all a bit crazy. There's no way that this orb thing that they all saw was a UFO with aliens aboard who abducted these 4 men. It does sound crazy, but there are a few aspects that add a little bit of credibility to their story. Okay, now we're going to get to those aspects, but before we do that, let's get back to Jim. The nightmares he was having were becoming more and more vivid, and he actually had to be admitted to the local hospital. He was becoming desperate, looking for answers, so he sought the expertise of renowned UFO expert Raymond Fowler. Jim was able to briefly talk to him at a conference he was speaking at. At first, Fowler was not too convinced. That is until Jim mentioned the lost time aspect. That was a common theme Fowler had heard from other stories. He was also interested in Jim's claim since there were 3 other men who were there. More witnesses add more credibility to any story. So after the conference, Fowler looked into Jim's background. He contacted his employer, his neighbors, his schoolmates, and all these people that knew Jim stated that he was a good guy. He was a man of integrity who wouldn't randomly make up a story. This was enough for Fowler to set up a meeting with the 4 men. They all got together and they described the encounter at Eagle Lake. They went into detail, the orb, the beam, and the loss of time. The story was interesting, but it still wasn't enough. Richard Fowler did not want to get fooled by these men. He had encountered many hoaxes throughout his career. But then he thought of a way to verify whether or not this event was true, or if they actually witnessed something. You see, Jim came to him in 1988. The UFO encounter occurred 12 years earlier in 1976. It's quite a gap. He wanted to know if anyone else knew about this encounter other than the four men way back in 1976. Obviously, if you wanted to create a hoax or make money, you're not going to make up a story and then wait 12 years. You're going to say, oh, last summer we saw a UFO, you know what I mean? So he wanted to see if they had told this story to other people way back in 1976. So he looked up where Jim worked in 1976 and contacted his boss. Surprisingly, his boss actually remembered Jim telling a story about a weird UFO that he saw out in the wilderness to all the other employees. Apparently, he told this story all the time. Fowler also wanted to contact someone who didn't know the twins at all, someone that knew one of the other men. So he talked to a friend of Chuck Rack. And that friend also verified that Chuck had talked about this strange UFO experience. But perhaps the best witness to all these stories back in the 1970s was the park ranger that they talked to the next day. This guy had no relation to the men at all, so he would be the perfect person to ask. Fowler initially had a hard time tracking them down because by the late 80s, he had a completely different job at working for the Maine Department of Forestry. But with some digging, he was able to get his current address and phone number. So he called him up and asked him if he had any recollection at all of a UFO UAP event in 1976. Right away, the ranger said yes, because it turns out they weren't the only people to see something strange that night. In fact, there were several other camp groups who filed reports of there being a strange light in the sky that evening. Now, if this is actually true, if he had actually contacted the park ranger, I couldn't find the park ranger's name, but if he actually contacted the real ranger and the ranger stated this, that does make the story a little bit more interesting. By this point, Fowler was convinced the men were telling the truth, and he suggested that they all undergo hypnosis to see if they can recall any lost memories. So there is a therapy technique known as regression hypnosis. This technique puts individuals into a relaxed, trance-like state, and in this state they're able to recall or relive past events. Usually it focuses on childhood trauma, so they underwent regression therapy. They all did this separately to see if their stories would match up. Essentially, they all described being aboard an alien spaceship where these weird creature bug-like figures did weird experiments on them. A few of the men recall witnessing their friends being experimented on, and then some of the men remember seeing the alien face right there above them, and they could remember details with their four fingers, and some of them remember being put back in the canoe. All these strange things that apparently they all got right. Now, experts note that there is a high risk of regression hypnosis producing false memories. Just because they said something during the therapy session doesn't mean it actually happened. But there is evidence that suggests that it's possible. Now, rather conveniently, the four men, remember, were art students. They were good at drawing and painting, and they were able to paint what they saw during this hypnosis segment. The drawings are pretty creepy. Yeah, that's kind of creepy. Richard Fowler actually released a book on this abduction. This is where I pretty much got all my information. Their experience started to get wider national attention, and they actually all went on the Joan Rivers talk show to talk about it. So what's actually going on here? What actually happened in the Allagash Wilderness back in 1976? Well, I actually think I know exactly what happened. I don't think Jim actually got abducted by aliens, but I do think he's telling the truth. Here's an aspect of the story that a lot of people leave out. In the mid-1980s, Jim actually had a head injury. He was in the hospital due to this head injury. And then after the head injury, that's when he started having these strange nightmares. What's also interesting is the way he described his nightmares sound very similar to sleep paralysis. Essentially, you're half awake and you're seeing weird figures, weird shadowy figures, and you're unable to move. What's interesting is back in the 1980s, people didn't really talk about sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis didn't really enter the mainstream media until 2010. But it's definitely a real thing. I have encountered it myself. I heard it, I didn't see any figures, but I heard a loud noise and I couldn't move for 40 seconds. It was terrifying. A lot of people have some really creepy sleep paralysis stories. Let me know if you have some in the comments below. But that's exactly what I think happened to Jim. Now, the connection to Jack is, I don't know if there's any truth behind the whole, identical twins being able to like share thoughts. I haven't really looked into that, but I have heard a lot about it. So maybe it's possible that after Jim had this head injury, Jack also had some weird side effects. Another major issue with this entire story is that in 2016, Chuck Rack, one of the abductees, he stated that the entire alien abduction story was made up. He stated that they got together in the 80s and they said, hey, let's make some money. But what I found really intriguing is when the interviewer asked him about the UFO UAP event back in the 70s, he stated that that actually occurred, which kind of adds credibility to that part of the story. Like if you're going to say, oh, we made up the abduction thing in the 80s, obviously, if you made up the UFO story, you're probably going to say, oh, we made that up too. But the fact that he said, no, that actually occurred, I don't know. It's kind of interesting. When it comes to the actual incident, the light that they saw in the sky, I think they just saw some weird natural phenomenon. A nocturnal light of sorts. There's many stories about weird nocturnal lights, sometimes referred to as ghost lights. One classic example is the Brown Mountain lights. It's highly possible that they saw some weird swamp gas thing, or maybe even Steve. So according to Ray Fowler, the night before they had this abduction experience, they actually watched the Northern Lights. Perhaps there was another display of the Northern Lights on the night that they were abducted, and they saw Steve, which is like a weird emission beam of energy that can occur during the Northern Lights. Of course, the most popular theory among skeptics is that they made up the entire story, from the UAP all the way to the abductions. But yeah, the whole art student thing, I mean, these people are obviously creative people, and creative people are often good at coming up with stories. And then there's the third theory, that they really did get abducted by aliens. There's a lot we don't know out there. I don't know, I'm kind of somewhere in between. I think they really did see something strange that night. I don't think it was an alien spaceship. I think it was some weird trick of the light. At the end of the day, the Allagash abduction is one of the most famous alien abduction stories there is. A lot of people say it's the most credible example of one. What are your thoughts? I'd like to know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.